and released the latest iteration of the Super Mario franchise, featuring a fully 3D world that would set the tone for pretty much every 3D platformer to come. We were also introduced to a version of Mario we'd never seen before, made of polygons rather than pixels. Mario has changed a lot since Super Mario 64, but just how much? I think it's time we get reacquainted. This is Low Poly. Okay, so anybody who's spent any time with Super Mario 64, this character should be very familiar. Obviously, this is the version of Mario that was in that game, but this is also the beginning of the journey of 3D Mario. This model of Mario used in the game is made up of 752 tries. A try is basically a 3-sided polygon as opposed to a 4-sided polygon known as a quad, and it'll have 3 verts or vertices to make the shape of the triangle and then one face to make the try. And if you have 752 of these, you'll get this handsome chappy here. Interestingly, and for comparison, the exterior of Peach's castle is made up of 871 tries. So for roughly 119 more tries, you can have all of this, or you can fit it all together and make this. Yeah. Now in 1996, this was ahead of its time, but if you compare it to today's models, it looks kind of primitive. The first thing we should probably point out is not all Mario's limbs are joined together, and there are clear partitions between like the top of the arms and the bottom of the arms, and the legs and the bottom of the legs, and the whole body has a split through the middle. It's kinda ugly. It wasn't too uncommon to see this kind of thing in early 3D games, and there is a reason for it. Early 3D character models during the N64, Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 era were built in this segmented way as it was easier to create animation for the character without having to deform the mesh, which would require more polygons to pull off convincingly, something we wouldn't see until the GameCube and PlayStation 2 era. The N64's limited rendering power meant that smooth skinning was often an impossibility. Characters were almost always built out of separate segments that rotated independently to simulate skinning. For example, the upper arm would be its own independent model, the lower arm would be as well, and so would the hand. These segments were then fully closed and had no holes at the ends, so gaps wouldn't appear during animation. Okay, now we've got the explanation out of the way, let's take a closer look at the model. Starting off with the face, obviously they didn't model Mario's face in detail, they basically just used a texture, and it's a very small texture size at that. So bam, you slap a couple of those on and you got Mario's face. Now that same aesthetic runs through the whole model, so the logo on his hat, that's also a texture, and so are the buttons. And that's pretty much all the texture work, everything else is just flat plain colors. For Mario's hands, they basically just modeled a ball shape, that's all they gave him. There is another hand model for this Mario, but it's just the Fuzzy Pickles peace sign when you collect a star, so I'm not going to show it because it's not that special. And when you check out the wireframe of this model, you can see just how low poly it really is, so that's your 752 polygons right there. Now before we move on from Super Mario 64, I just have to show off this guy that you may or may not know about. Now this guy is Nintendo's way of optimizing gameplay and memory usage, and what they would do is swap out this guy for the main Mario model whenever the camera was a certain distance away from the player. Now he's roughly a third of the main Mario's poly count, so this guy is 208 tries. Now at the distance you would see this model anyway, which was kinda hard to make out, so this is a close-up. They basically just used the same textures they used on the main model, but they sacrificed a lot in the face. Now basically his nose is triangular, his hands are like big shovels, his hat is basically just, it's something else. Just to look at it, it's like a giant wedge. And his body and his limbs are basically just squares. That's kind of it, that's all they needed. I think now is a good time to state that Nintendo made this. So, you know, wow. Amazingly, this isn't even as bad as the low poly Marios get, so stick around. I got some treats for you. So now it's 1998 and Nintendo released Mario Party. Now this model of Mario is lower poly than the main model in Super Mario 64 at 406 tries. And just like the Mario 64 model, a lot of the detail is just texture work. The modeling is slightly better now, so we can see that Mario actually has a full body. It's not split in two, but if we take a look at the wireframe of this model, we can see that they cheated in joining or not joining certain elements of the body. So for instance, the ears aren't actually joined to the head and neither is the peak of Mario's cap. But honestly, you can barely see Mario in this game, so there is a reason that he's so low poly. The difference between this Mario and the Mario 64 model is actually not a lot, so let's move on to Super Smash Bros. It's 1999 and this is the model that they went with. Now interestingly, this model is even lower poly than the model we've just seen. At just 320 tries, it seems that for each subsequent game on the N64, Mario got lower and lower poly. Again, we got the same story with the textures carrying all the detail, but can we just talk about Mario's Chaos Emerald hands? I mean, look at the size of those things. Also worth mentioning is Mario's super spiky hair at the back. They just kind of cheaped out on that and just went for 2 cones. That's supposed to be hair. Ladies and gentlemen, that is hair. Okay, so that's the N64 games. Let's move on to the GameCube era. In 2001, Nintendo released Super Smash Bros. Melee, and this particular Mario model marks a time when Nintendo went for a more realistic spin on Mario's design. The main model for Mario is 4,718 tries, so that's a huge leap from the 752 of the Mario 64 model. You'll also see that this model actually has the body as one full mesh. By the time they made this game, they realized how they could make elbows and knees bend nicely without having to have 2 separate meshes. If we turn on the wireframe for this model, you can see there's a lot going on around the knees and the elbows. By having a lot of polygons concentrated around these areas where the arms or the legs would crease, you can get a nice bend out of the arms or the legs without losing their shape. Taking a look at Mario's face now, we can see that a lot of the elements of his face are actually modeled this time, including the mustache. And if we turn on the wireframe, you can see that the eyes have their own little model part, and so does the mouth. Another small detail is that the fingers are individually modeled. They're not one big clump of a hand. For 2001, this is quite a detailed model for Mario. Similar to how Super Mario 64 had a main Mario model and an even lower poly Mario, Melee does the exact same thing and has this Mario model, which is 332 tries in place of the larger poly model. And it has to easily be one of the uglier Mario models I've ever seen. The combination of the realistic low-resolution textures and the low-poly modeling just doesn't mesh well with me. No pun intended. The ears are barely joined to the head. I mean, everything just looks wrong. But of course, this model would only ever be seen when the camera is far away, so we'd never be up this close, so it's very easy to scrutinize when we have a closer look. What I guess I'm saying is that it does the job it was intended to do. Okay, let's move on to everyone's favorite game, Super Mario Sunshine. Being the first main Mario game as opposed to Super Mario 64, let's see just how things have changed since then. Now, right off the bat, this Mario model is 1,348 tries. So in essence, we're double the poly count of the Super Mario 64 model. Nintendo became a bit more sophisticated in how they dealt with the meshes of the actual character. For instance, again, this is one full body mesh that's all joined together apart from the head. Just like the Melee model, they figured out how they could bend the elbows and the knees, but without using too many polygons. You can see this if we turn on the wireframe and notice just how simple the arrangement of polygons is around these certain joints. Laying out the polygons like this would ensure that whenever the knee bends, the leg doesn't lose its form. Looking at Mario's face, we can see again the mustache is modeled and not just a texture like it was in Super Mario 64. Of course, a lot of the detail is in the textures, but these textures are infinitely better than we saw in the N64 days. For instance, Mario actually has proper ears now. You were never actually able to get that close to the model in Mario Sunshine, so this is a very appropriate level of detail for this model. Now, the next model of Mario is from Super Mario 64 DS, so we can now have a direct comparison between the N64 version and this new remake. And one of the most surprising things is this actually has less polygons than the N64 version at 636 tries. But here we can see the textures actually have more detail than the N64 version, so this is what carries all of the detail of the model. Another thing to note is the body is one full mesh, so they're saving a lot of polygons there too. It's amazing to see just how much more efficient Nintendo became with their models in the Mario games as time went on. This Mario model is a perfect example of this because it demonstrates clearly that less is actually more, and they didn't have to resort to it looking like this one. However, not all the Mario models look that great when they're that low poly, and this one from Mario Kart DS is a perfect example of that. Now, taking into account the Nintendo DS's resolution, you were never able to see these models in that great detail, but I don't even know what to say about this one. Now, the face isn't actually that bad. From a distance, you can still see it's Mario. And they didn't model Mario's legs because he'd be sat in a cart, so they'd be obscured, so that makes sense. dots. And his arms and his fists are basically just squares, that's all they are. At just 162 tries, I think this is the lowest poly version of Mario in any game that he's been in. And it still looks better than the low poly version of Mario in Super Mario 64. Jumping all the way to 2007 now for Super Mario Galaxy and also Super Mario Galaxy 2. The model used in the Galaxy games is the exact same thing, but it's also one of the cleanest Mario models we've seen so far. Sitting at 4,877 tries, we're now going higher and higher in poly count. If we take a close-up on the face and go into wireframe, we can see that all Mario's facial features are fully modeled. The eyes, the ears, the eyebrows, the mustache, the mouth, it's all realized with modeling. Even things like Mario's sideburns are fully modeled. Mario's hands are also fully modeled, but what they did is they would swap out different hand poses for each different animation. They would swap the hand poses out so quickly during animation that you'd never even notice. It's also worth noting that this model actually has a version of Mario's head with no hat and just a hat separately. Now this does happen with other Mario models in other games, but it's somehow more significant in this one. The reason being, Mario actually has more style in his hair when the hat's not on his head, and that is something that became more apparent with the Galaxy games. Yet again, in the wireframe, we can see more efficient work around the knees and the elbows. As we've mentioned previously, having more polygons concentrated around these areas creates better bends in the arms and the legs. The animations they were able to pull from this model were some of the most clean and smooth I've seen in the entire Mario series, and then it only got better as games went on. Another first for the Galaxy games is how they animated Mario's eyes. They basically just used the texture of the pupil with an alpha channel, and then they could move that around the eyeball. Let's just put those eyeballs back in Mario's head, that looks kind of painful. Going slightly back in time now, we're gonna take a look at Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Now again, with the Smash series, they decided to go for a more realistic approach, but the modeling of Mario in Brawl is a lot more rounded than it was in Melee, and that's thanks to about 500 more tries than the Melee model. Just like Super Mario Galaxy, all of Mario's facial features are modeled and then emphasized using textures. The eye animation is also handled in exactly the same way as the Galaxy games, with the eye just being another texture slapped on top of another texture with an alpha channel. Comparatively, I have to say the textures used in the Brawl model are a lot nicer than the ones used in the Melee model, but you could probably chalk that up to resolution. All in all, the Brawl model and the Melee model are kinda similar, and there's not too much change, just a higher poly count. So let's move on to Super Mario 3D Land. So it's now 2011 and we're on the brand new Nintendo 3DS. Now this Mario model is actually higher poly than the one used in Super Mario Sunshine. Again, considering the 3DS's resolution, this model is perfect for that game. Honestly, there's not too much to say about this model, it's very efficient in what it does. The modeling around the elbows and the knees is quite simple, kind of like how it was in Sunshine. Although, interestingly, the extra polygons that were used in this model seem to have been spent around those joints. If we directly compare those two models, the Sunshine model and the 3D Land model, we can see that they use a slightly different setup on the knees. Now this isn't really anything to make a huge deal of, but it shows just how much the team were willing to push the models to get good animation. On a closing note for this model, you'll see that not all the facial features have been modeled completely, which is interesting, the ones they actually chose to model. For instance, they chose to model Mario's sideburns and not his eyebrows. They didn't even model Mario's mouth. I guess they thought the sideburns were more expressive than the mouth and the eyebrows? Who knows. I guess at least Mario has a modeled mustache this time, but it's literally just a flat plane wrapped around Mario's face. Sticking with the 3DS, let's talk about Mario Kart 7. Released in exactly the same year as Super Mario 3D Land, we're gonna take a look at the two models that were actually in this game of Mario. The first Mario model is the main model used in the game, and it consists of 471 tries. So it's amazingly even lower poly than the main Mario model used in Super Mario 64 DS, which sat at 636 tries. Now this Mario model looks a lot more angular than the ones we've seen so far. Mario's super pointy hair from Smash is returned at the back of his head, and the tips of Mario's feet are crazy pointy. I wouldn't want to be kicked with those things. I have to say that is some masterful texturing around the fists. I mean, those are like just big blocks, and they kind of made that work. However, I'm not so sure that looks comfortable the way they did his legs. They're really pushed up into his stomach. Now this is the main Mario model used by the player character, so let's check out the even lower poly version of this. Now this model is used by the CPU players on the track. Now obviously they'd be at a distance, so you wouldn't see these details like the cheese wedge hands, Mario's golf club feet, or the all-the-rage Mario elf ears. They are on point. And Mario has no butt, because, you know, he was always sat in a cart, so so you were never meant to see it, so Mario has no butt. I mean, that right there is one of my favorite details about this model, or the lack thereof. Also, I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I took the camera inside Mario's head. But then that took me down another road that went something like this. Okay, whoa, we need to stop this now. Let's move on to the next model. It's now 2013, we're on the Wii U, and this is Super Mario 3D World. And this game has some of the cleanest models I've ever seen in a Mario game, and Mario himself is no exception. At a whopping 9,128 tries, this is what you get. To truly appreciate how much detail has gone into this model, let's turn on the wireframe. In just Mario's nose alone, there are 256 tries, which is more than this model, and this model, and this model, in just Mario's nose. When we were looking at the Super Mario Galaxy model, we learned that when they wanted to animate the hands, they would just swap out the different hand poses. Well, imagine they did that for all the hands in this game, but not just the hands, but also Mario's facial expressions. Mario has 9 different facial expressions that range from holding his breath, from pouting, to being angry or surprised. And these expressions would just be swapped out whenever it was necessary. He even has 2 models for his eyes blinking, one half open and one completely closed. The level of polish on this Mario model from 3D World is something else, but what if I told you this isn't even the highest poly model? That title belongs to this model from the Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games 2014 and the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. This model is a staggering 10,656 tries. It's super detailed, super clean, and it doesn't feature any extra hand poses or facial poses, meaning they were able to get all the animations in that game just out of this one model with no extra tweaks, which of all the Mario models we've seen so far, that's really impressive. But here's something interesting about this model. The Mario and Sonic games are developed by Sega. In trying to research and come up with a definitive answer, I couldn't actually find anything, but everything I did find kind of pointed to this one thing. One of the highest poly Mario models we've seen may or may not have been modeled by Sega. I mean, wow, imagine if that is the case. Now, Nintendo definitely published these games, but it's unclear if these models were donated by Nintendo to Sega to finish the game. If anybody knows any different, please let me know, I'd love to find this out. So, 3D Mario has changed a lot in the past 20 years. He was there at the very beginning of 3D platformers, and he's still going strong today. Sure, he's had some growing pains, but they're just a sign of the times. And even though we've seen the progression of Mario from very low poly to reasonably high poly, well, it's not over yet. Yeah. Thanks for watching the very first episode of Low Poly, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is going to become a permanent series on the channel, so let me know how you felt and if there's anything you really want to see from the rest of the series. Don't forget you can follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, where I usually post little sneak peeks of things I'm working on. It's a great way for you guys to keep up to date with the channel and everything that's happening with this show. And as always, a huge thanks to everybody who supports the Patreon. You guys are the ones that make it all possible.